Greetings, dear viewers, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to Addis Dialogue with the program. I'm Shifarao, and I've got you a special guest today. She's Hadra Ahmed. She's the Emmy Award-winning producer, the Gerald Loeb Award-winning journalist. She's a media and communications specialist and Pan-Africanist. We're going to talk about a host of issues in these areas. Hadra, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Shfar.
Wow, so I'm so glad to have you on my show, Hadra. And obviously, I'm gonna begin with your recognition. So, you were one of the producers to win this prestigious Emmy Award. Most importantly, I've learned that you are the first African female journalist to have achieved such a success. So walk me through, some of the selection processes and how you managed to go up this ladder of recognition.
Thank you. It's fascinating and it's interesting. When we start out as journalists in Ethiopia, we don't really foresee where we go, where we would end up. I was a print journalist. I used to work for Fortune newspaper here in Ethiopia, and that's how I started my journalism journey. From that, I became a correspondent for different media outlets in different countries, covering the region and different African countries. And then from then on, I moved on to broadcasting journalism.
Okay.
So broadcasting journalism is about filming, telling stories through videos, and then it involves a lot of things. One of it is producing. And because I was able to work as a producer for different media outlets and internationally recognized producers, I was basically trained on the job. But when this incident happened, I was closely following the issue. So I wrote a different number of articles for international media outlets, including the New York Times.
Yeah.
So from then on, when ABC were looking for someone to work with here in Ethiopia on this project, because initially it's the ABC's project, and so they reached out to us, and so we took it from there. The filming took almost a year, 1 year, because we had to go through the investigation process. We had to find out the families that were impacted by this devastating incident, and also because how big the story and the issue is, it encompasses Ethiopia, Indonesia, and also the United States. And we had to work with all the three teams, and I guess, they submitted the documentary and it was nominated, but we didn't even know that it was nominated. We just found out that one morning the documentary won an Emmy, and my name was included. Nugusu's name was also in the contributors list. And, then later we found out that we're the first Ethiopian Emmy winners.
I was about to ask, were you expecting it, or was it, all of a sudden that came to your surprise, or you've already answered?
No, we didn't expect it. I didn't foresee any of this, to be honest, but we really put our hearts and soul into the production, because it's about the families, it's about Ethiopians, it's about the country's image.
Right.
If you remember, during the incident, there were so many racist sort of campaigns and comments online on social media, on different media outlets. They were even questioning, does Ethiopia even have a plane? They were not even acknowledging the fact that it's
so patronizing.
Exactly. So we had to make sure throughout all this process, we had to make sure that we were doing a story that also represents the country. So we had to do everything possible in our power to ensure that. And our colleagues in the US, the ABC producers, they were really great, and that's how we managed to tell the story, the Ethiopian side of the story.
Wow, that's amazing. By the way, congratulations for this great achievement. I should have said that earlier.
Thank you.
So you're experienced correspondent with a demonstrated history of working in the media landscape. The hustle and bustle, everything when it comes to media. As a person who is well in the know in this area, how do you evaluate the trending narratives of media outlets across the world, especially Western ones, when it comes to Ethiopia. What trending stories do you see?
This is the thing. It's even in general terms.
Yeah.
If you don't tell me your truth, you're giving me a space to make up everything I want about you.
Exactly.
So I can just say whatever I want about you without you defending your truth. And that's what I think is happening in Ethiopia. As journalists, as in different spectrum, print, digital, and broadcasting, in all of these variety of media outlets, I feel like we lack from telling our own stories as Ethiopian journalists who are exposed to the international media outlets and organizations. That's one. And two, we as Ethiopian journalists, I truly believe that journalists in Ethiopia are outstanding because we have lack of so many equipment that we need to do in order to produce a quality material. We lack access to information.
Exactly.
We lack the funding. There are so many things that we lack, but as journalists, we still do our job. We still do produce stories that represent the country, the people, the culture, and the tradition. But in all of that, our stories are somehow, they're still read and reported and reflected upon within the country. We haven't managed to go out and penetrate the international organizations, you know, and it's because maybe they have their own standards, they have their probably, you know, editorial policies and all of that they need to follow, but still we haven't been able to, you know, go beyond penetrate the international market. So that really gave the complete freedom for whichever media outlets to come out and say whatever they want about Ethiopian, you know, narrative and people and history and all of that. We usually hear that Ethiopia's story is history is divided. It's so Ethiopia's political landscape or narrative is divided. But who's you know, injecting that narrative?
Right.
Are we the ones? Are we actually doing anything to prevent that? And so, in order to curb all of this, in order to ensure that we have our stories are out there from our own perspective, there are so many gaps that need to be filled.
Absolutely.
One of it is access to information.
Yeah. So obviously silence can be taken as a sort of agreement, because since we are not that prevalent across the global media outlets, we are keeping silent, we are not that much into the thing, so this means kind of agreement to whatever they say. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, you know, silence is taken usually as a yes, so we should be able to say no. And, you know, I mean, I'm sure you've met so many journalists. Which journalist have you come across that are, you know, ambitious enough to say, you know what, I'm going to write a story and I'm going to submit it to any international media outlet or any international recognition platforms? You don't really see that. And then there is also this idea of, no, we're Ethiopians, we do our stories and we don't care about anyone else's approval. But that's not how it works, because it's a global world and journalism is literally a village. Someone could Google your name and they can find you and see what you say. And so your way of telling your story, your way of approaching any kind of idea or concept, that's what really means to go out there and ensure that the story that about Ethiopia is told by Ethiopians, and you know, we have done it. Let me give you one very good example.
Please do.
When this tragic incident happened, you know, journalists from all over the world came to Ethiopia. They went to the crash site, they filmed, they spoke to witnesses, they spoke to officials, and they have this lots and lots of footage they filmed and photographs. But only one journalist, his name is Mulugeta, he is the only one who took a picture of a woman who was throwing a sand on her face. that would not mean anything for anyone else, you know, for all those international photographers. They didn't see that. They didn't know the meaning of it. But who understood that? Mulugeta, the Ethiopian photographer, who also won the World Press, who won an award.
Right.
And so he took that picture because that is an Ethiopian way of mourning your loved one.
He knows the culture.
Yes, exactly. He knows that's how she felt, you know. You see someone throwing the sand on her face, you know, the hitting of the chest. All of that is a way of Ethiopians expressing their sorrow and sadness. And he picked that up. No one else did. And that's what it means, telling our own stories from our own perspective and narrative.
Yes.
Ethiopians, we're not only defined by our politics or, you know, that divided history and the ethnic division and all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have music history, we have our relationship as people, our tradition, our food, everything is a story to be told that is not touched by anyone.
Talking about media, again, I really want your take when it comes to the areas that Ethiopia is most hit.
Every media outlet, they have one thing in common, which is the editorial policy. The editorial policy differs from one to another, obviously, but there are some similarities in there. Yeah. But one of the things that really sells in the media is, you know, the common term, that clickbait. And so, you know, stories that are considered to be attracting the audience will always get that, you know, that viewership, and the stories will obviously all the time lean towards that kind of story, which is what's happening in the country now, is the war. So every story that's coming out of Ethiopia is the war, or the, you know, the common story of famine and drought. So these are the stories that Ethiopia is sort of painted as, or even in articles, that's the story as a context, as a background, as a description. That is what's included. And again, it all comes back to the point I was trying to make earlier. That's because what are we doing?
Hoax news, propaganda, misinformation, disinformation, not only when it comes to Ethiopia, but also the whole continent of Africa. So how should journalists, African journalists, refute such false narratives? What are some of the areas that you see?
It's a very interesting question, because it's always anything that you want to do. If you don't do it, someone else will do it. It's just it comes back to that. And as journalists, we need to read, we need to understand our context, we need to be able to stand on our ground, on the stories that we're publishing. A lot of misunderstanding when it comes to local journalists and international media outlets. One of the things is they somehow, more or less, not all of them, but some of them believe that if you're a local journalist, you will only be writing the flowery things about the continent. You know, the continent is still ravaged by corruption, unemployment, lack of health facilities, lack of women equality. All of that is an issue within the country. But if we're able to tell those stories, if we manage to you know, also cover those stories, not neglecting those stories, it would also mean that we're also telling the good stories at the same time, because we would be able to create a relationship and a trust between the journalist communities all over the country, all over the continent. We don't also have that culture of working within the continent, within journalists within the continent.
Right.
How many, you know, like, even in Ethiopia, if you've seen, if there is any journalism training, any kind of support, it's usually from either Al Jazeera or the BBC or any other international media outlets. And so we're sort of lean towards this organization to show us the ropes. Yes, of course, they have the experience, years of, you know, something that we can pick up on from them. But it's also important to create that intercontinental journalist collaborations, work with a journalist from Ethiopia with Kenya or with South Africa or with other African countries that we have similarities with, because we do have a lot of similarities.
Yeah, yeah. I want to come to your personal experience, you know, in the reporting thing. Have you been forced, so to speak, to kind of do some propaganda by some of your, you know, organizations that you worked for? There's such a thing, or a time when you had to do this thing that you don't want to do, and you said no? And if so, can you share your experience to our listeners?
To be honest, I've worked with a lot of international media outlets, but so far, luckily, I have never been asked to do anything that I do not believe in, that I did not believe in. But what I have noticed is when they want to do a story, they have a general concept of what they want to do. So what they do is they would reach out to me, they would ask, so this is the story that we want to do, but what is the specifics of this specific issue? For instance, there was a time where we wanted to do a story about women who are in labor, but they don't have surgical facilities in the area. So what we did was, they said they had that information, and so we went through specifications. Which location do we go to? What kind of training are they given? What kind of person, which one of the nurses will be willing to be interviewed on TV? And then who would be, you know, a mother who's pregnant,
Right.
who will she be willing to be filmed while she's going through a C-section? So all of that, we had to plan, we had to sort out everything in order to make sure that we have the story well organized and be appealing for the audience to tell. So what I would usually do is, if there are any misunderstandings, I will try to correct that and explain facts and some other things that need to be polished. But otherwise, luckily I have never been asked to report on anything that I did not believe in, and I do not also take on assignments something that I do not agree with or I do not believe in. Like I said before, I was working as, you know, a producer or as a broadcasting journalist. I was a print journalist, and those stories are available online. So they see what I write, they see where I stand, they see the kind of stories that I want to publish out of Ethiopia. So no one would come, you know, no one would dare to come and say,
Do this,
we want you to lie to do this, because there is a reputation that, luckily, through so many people's help and support that I have built. And so I had that experience, and so when I was working with also experienced producers, I managed to bring both worlds together, and then I picked up lessons from here and there. And you know.
Let me take you back to your recognition. And you wrote, following the recognition, you wrote that filming and producing this project for a year was both rewarding and insightful in its aspects of production and life itself. You also say you wouldn't have achieved the success without your partner. Can you tell me more about your partner?
Gladly. So, because he doesn't like to be on the media, so I have to speak about
that's
him.
That's why I'm asking you. Right?
So Nugusu Salomon is, by profession, he's an engineer. He's a computer engineer. So as you can imagine, he knows a lot of things about technical things and, you know, all of that technical stuff. So it's interesting because even when I planned to start Nubia, it was very difficult for me. It took me years because I couldn't find, you know, viable partners that have the same vision that I had, because it's a Pan-African company. We tell stories of, you know, what is, you know, about the people, the culture, and all of that. And so Nugusu was the person who told me to push forward, you know, not to give up. And so we finally decided to work with him because he agreed to be a partner. And so we started working together, and throughout our journey we managed to work with different organizations. And he's not a journalist, he doesn't have a journalist background, but he's a curious mind. So you give him anything, if he's interested in anything, he will research about it, he will study, he will read. and then he will make himself an expert as much as any other person that is an expert on a certain topic. And also because his engineering, his technical mind, a lot of people call him the wizard of computers.
Oh.
Because he believes that you face any problem, there is always a solution. If it's digitally that can be fixed, he'll find a solution. He will write an app, he will develop a website, and then he will come up with some sort of solution to make things easy in our work. But also in life in general, he finds solutions here and there. And so when we fully went to producing and production, so he started again, researching about cameras. It's just 24 hours understanding how cameras work, how colors work, what is, and then he finally one day said, a lot of people say filming or cameras are an artistic thing, but cameras are science. It's all numbers.
Whoa.
So when you're filming when you have 2-3 cameras, you have to, sync them and make them look similar using a number, and that's a number. He sits down, he writes the number, and he calibrates the camera with the lenses. And so all of that technical stuff that we do as a production company, it's basically all him. And that's why everything on the Ethiopian side of this documentary is filmed by him. And that was only possible because he had to study the plane again. He had to study which part of the plane do I need to focus on the camera. When the journalist says angle of attack, I'm saying angle of attack now, but you don't have the visual of what an angle of attack is. He had to research that, and then we had to film that. We had to film the wing, we have to film all of that technical stuff on the plane. He had to also research that. So in that aspect of the technical part, filming there in very, very, emotional moments where we were both crying at one point while we were filming, but we had to be really there and to do all of that. And all of that was possible only because Nugusu was there with us. Because my job mostly, I do film, I will use the second camera as well, but mainly it's him, So, but my job is to do the pre-production, and then during the production, it's all him. Okay. And it would not have been possible. Wow. And I'm glad he became the first Emmy-winning director photographer. And we, in an industry that a lot of focus is not given, because if you say you're a cameraman, oh, okay, do you film weddings? And filming wedding is a very complicated and sophisticated thing, but it's sort of seen as a lesser profession. But I'm glad that he managed to say, no, it's possible to do that. As a, as cameraman, that is something to strive for. Wow, amazing, amazing. I think he deserves this recognition. Oh yeah, he does, definitely. Absolutely. Pan-Africanism and regional integration are, topical issues going on over and over again when it comes to Africa. So what contributions should journalists play for its fruition, for the success of this Pan-Africanist idea? As Ethiopians, everyone in the continent of Africa, I do believe are Pan-Africanists, because we all strive to make the continent, to make our countries better. And, that is basically Pan-Africanism, to love your country, to love who you are. But the issue with Ethiopians is, there is this thing that we grew up with learning. We just say, he's African, or she is African. We have sort of built that separation between being an Ethiopian and being an African. And so that is something that we really need to work towards at the moment, because right now, especially recently, in the past 2-3 years, the regional integration and the idea of Pan-Africanism is more coming forward to the country, which is something that we've never seen before. yes, there are relations between Ethiopia and few other African countries, but it wasn't to the level that is targeting the whole continent. So as journalists, what we can do, as Ethiopian journalists especially, is to look at other African countries' experiences and how other journalists in these different parts of Africa, how do they report their stories?
Yeah.
The stories that are being produced by African journalists, by Kenyan journalists, by South African, by Nigerian, by Ghanaian journalists, all of these countries. If you look at journalists in Nigeria, for instance, they are brilliant, they're amazing, the stories they do. For instance, the CNN African Voices correspondent, or the presenter, is a Nigerian woman. She is brilliant. The stories she tells, the young people, the entrepreneurs, the musicians, the artists, all of that, because all of that stories is now going to CNN, and it's been viewed by millions of international viewers. That's, a very crucial thing to show for an international audience. And so as Ethiopian journalists, we should be able to go out of the Addis, we should be able to explore all parts of the country. We have over 80 ethnic groups and over 100 languages and dialects, and it's a beautiful, beautiful story to tell. And then we pick that up and then collaborate that with a journalist from other African countries. Not just invite African journalists to Ethiopia to report on, when something political is happening or some big event is happening, but actually to invite them.
Yeah.
Let me give you one example. I was able to go to Poland a few years ago, and then that was only because the government of Poland here, the embassy, they organized a visit to Poland for African journalists to show them the different cultures of different cities in Poland.
Okay.
So we visited their their music hubs, we visited their museums, we visited their industrial parks, we visited all these beautiful things. And then every journalist, back then I used to work for an Indian media organization called INS, so I had to find a way to do a story between the relationship between India and Poland, because that was my audience.
Okay.
But journalists from Tanzania, journalists from Kenya, South Africa, even other journalists who went to Poland from Ethiopia, they had to write stories about how amazing Poland is in different aspects on our newspapers.
Wow.
So that's what we need to do. We should be open to journalists. We don't always want to do, or it's not always that we have this malicious intent of writing terrible things about the country. Like I said, we're like, as Nubia, even as a journalist in the when I was actively writing, and as Nubia now, what we mostly focus on is on the human interest story, because that's something we can sell, something beautiful that we can show. I'm just gonna give you one more example. I know it's a very long response. We were doing this TV show. It's called Iftar Talks. So Iftar Talks is a TV show that aired during the breaking fast during Ramadan, Iftar.
Okay.
So that story basically is, last year it just so happened Ramadan and Aris were at the same time.
Yeah.
So we selected topics: fasting, kindness, family values, addiction, mental health, knowledge. So we selected these topics, and we brought people from different backgrounds, from Muslim, Orthodox Christian, Protestant Christians, and other people who practice, spirituality, and different aspects, different group of people, and asked them about these topics. What is fasting, for instance? What is knowledge? What does seeking knowledge mean? How can we be kind to each other? How can we value our families? And so we did that video, and it was amazing. The reception was great. That was only because, you see, we focused on topics that have, values, telling us their experience from religious perspective, from, you know, educational perspective, from an expert perspective. And one of those people were Haji Adam, and he said, he stressed actually, he said, there's one thing that we need to promote as Ethiopians, and that's the climate of Ethiopia.
Climate?
The climate, yeah.
Okay.
You know, he said, if we could focus on, like in the Middle East, for instance,
all right,
Ethiopia could be like a climate tourist destination.
Wow, this is new perspective.
Yeah, imagine, we can do so much.
Hadra Ahmed, thank you so much for this opportunity, for your ideas.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, dear viewers, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for having been next time with another program. It's goodbye from me, Shifa Rawlak.